everyone. Welcome to Chapter 20, the death penalty. Death penalty is a controversial subject. And since 1936, the Gallup Company, that's the same company that does presidential polls, has surveyed American citizens. And from 1936 to 1960, the United States citizens supported the death penalty by a pretty overwhelming margin. In 1960, it was the first time that the United States citizens did not support the death penalty, and it continued to drop to 1966, where 42% of Americans supported the death penalty, which means, of course, that 58% did not. In 1967, the Supreme Court of the United States put a moratorium on the death penalty in the United States while it reviewed a few serious cases. It was reinstated in 1970. It was abolished in 1972, but reinstated in 1976. And since 1976, it continued to rise, reaching a peak in 1994 with 80% of Americans supporting the death penalty. Nowadays, it's about 50-50, but that changes depending on what's in the news. So a few years ago, Texas, which uses lethal injections, had a couple of horrific executions where the solution that was used did not kill the person that it was supposed to kill, and instead it made them feel as if their blood was burning or boiling, right? So there were media witnesses to this, and they reported how horrific and how much pain this person was in, and that changed some people's minds. Other people said, he was a murderer, so good for him, but other people, it changed their minds, right? So that goes depending on what's in the news. If a horrific crime comes into the news, some murder of a child, then that changes public opinion too. But right now it's about 50-50. Between 1930 and 1967, 3,859 people were executed. So it started to drop from that point on, it started to drop from that point on, with the most executions in this country being in 1935 with 199 executions, and from that point it steadily dropped. Once again, we talked about in 1972, it was declared unconstitutional. In 1976, it was reinstated. Now, there's a few things about the death penalty that should also be discussed. So, the people that support it for a few reasons, right? One of the reasons they support it is because they say it's a deterrent, right? And that's a term we used earlier in this course, and of course the last year in law enforcement and policing. Deterrence is the idea that you make the punishment severe enough that it convinces other people not to do that crime, right? So that comes from Cesare Beccaria, who introduced natural law, right, to the criminal justice system. So they say it's a deterrent, right? And then they also say it's retribution, right? You've killed somebody, and now you're going to be killed. So that's another term we've talked about in criminal justice teachings, right? Retribution. One of the problems with that is that there is no statistical data to say that there is a deterrence factor involved, but it's kind of a hard thing to prove, because if you don't kill anybody, how do they know you're really capable of doing it, right? So what they generally do is they say they check the murder level. So when executions are high, or does the murder level go down, right? Statistically, there is no pattern to see with that. And the other criminal justice theory that is discussed with the death penalty is incapacitation, right? So if you're murdered, if you murder someone and then you are killed, you can't murder anybody anymore. You are incapacitated from murder, right? People that are against the death penalty will point to the lack of statistical evidence for the deterrent. They would talk about the morality of the state-sanctioned killing, which some people consider murder itself, right? The intentional killing of another human being. And then they'll also talk about how you can incapacitate somebody by imprisoning them for life, which in this country, it is very rare for life to actually be life, right? Which we've talked about in previous lessons. So the Supreme Court has a lot to do with the death penalty and how it is used in this country. In fact, it is completely decided how it will be used, how we will use this in our country, right? So we talked earlier or this year and in last semesters about how the Supreme Court did not get involved in the criminal justice system very often until the 1960s, where it seemed to pick up speed. Most of our major court decisions about constitutional rights were started in the 1960s. But in 1972, Furman versus Georgia, the Supreme Court declared that the death penalty was unconstitutional as it was presently administered. So it didn't say the whole idea of death penalty was unconstitutional. It said the way we were doing it in Furman versus Georgia was unconstitutional, and so it declared the death penalty unconstitutional across the country, right? Showing how our criminal justice system works. Different states, and of course Georgia setting another precedent here, continue to have decisions that involve the death penalty, sentencing people to death and putting them on death row, even though the Supreme Court wouldn't let them execute anybody anymore. So in Gregg versus Georgia, the Supreme Court came up with another decision, right? It said that the death penalty was constitutional if it was decided in separate phases, right? So you had a trial to decide guilt or innocence, and if you were found guilty, then you had a hearing or a mini trial to decide whether or not the death penalty would be used, right? So that happened in 1976, which effectively reinstated the death penalty at that point. In 1987, McCluskey versus Kemp, the Supreme Court recognized that there was a racial disparity in the way the death penalty was used, which essentially said that more African Americans were on death row or much more likely to be on death row than other races, and they acknowledged it, but they said they refused to say that it was unconstitutional, right? And a lot of death penalty opponents kind of hung their hat on this decision, before it was made, to say once they recognized the disparity, they will no longer allow executions, but it didn't work out that way. In Atkins versus Virginia in 2002, the Supreme Court stated that the developmentally disabled individuals could not be sentenced to death. And developmentally disabled individuals, we used to refer to them as, we used to say they were mentally retarded. Essentially, they had a very low IQ, and they did not understand their actions, as well as somebody who had a higher intelligence level, right? This was controversial back then. Same year, Ring versus Arizona, the Supreme Court said that juries must decide if the death penalty will be used. Judges were no longer allowed to do it. So you still had to have the two phases, the two separate processes, but also the jury that decided the guilt or innocence would also have to decide whether or not the death penalty would be used. In 2005, Roper versus Simmons, the Supreme Court decided that 18-year-olds could not be sentenced to death, right? They could not be sentenced to death. I'm sorry, if you were under 18 years old, you could not be sentenced to death. When it comes to the mentally ill, it's a little bit controversial, right? So in Ford versus Wainwright in 1985, the Supreme Court effectively said that you could not execute a mentally ill person, but it's not a simple case, right? So so Ford had murdered a police officer during a robbery, right? And there was no question about that. He had done that. He was robbing I think it was a diner, but when he was fleeing the scene, he killed a police officer on his way out. And he was found guilty and was given the death penalty, right? So while he was on death row, he apparently had gone insane, right? There was no indication or no statement that said he was insane before he committed his crimes, right? But when he was on death row, they said he had become insane, and so they had an assessment of him, right? They had a psychological assessment, and the assessment said, yes, he is insane. He is no longer understands the difference between right and wrong, and they said that essentially that death row was responsible for that. So the Supreme Court said you cannot kill somebody who has been declared mentally ill to the point where they do not understand what they did was wrong. You cannot execute somebody who is severely mentally ill. And so now that the debate that goes on is, especially within the medical community, is do you cure these people? And if you cure them, can they then go back onto death row? And different court decisions have come and gone with that, with the Supreme Court not really weighing in. But that is a controversy in the medical profession. Do you cure somebody with mental illness or try to cure somebody with mental illness in order to put them back on death row? Right? In 2008, Kennedy versus Louisiana, this was a case where it was a child rape, right? Kennedy had raped I think a 5-year-old and severely damaged this 5-year-old, but had not killed her. And he was given the death penalty, but the Supreme Court said, no, if you're going to give the death penalty, the victim must have died, must have been killed as a result of the crime, right? Just like a summary of the way the death penalty works in our country, right? 2 out of 3 of all death penalty cases are overturned on appeal, right? And the two most often cited reasons are incompetent counsel, which means the lawyer who was involved to defend the perpetrator did not do a good job, and errors by police or prosecutors. And errors is a polite word. There have been Supreme Court decisions that, separate from the death penalty, that basically said that the police and the prosecutors are not playing fair, and they must change the way they do things, right? And this also goes back to these decisions like Miranda versus Arizona, Escobedo, Brady. These were all decisions that where cases where the police and prosecutors did not handle evidence correctly, or got confessions that ended up being false, or were thrown out of court. And so that's one of the more prevalent reasons for death penalty being overturned. And I think what this shows us is that the light of justice shines brightest on the most serious cases. So the courts recognize that if somebody's life is on the line, we really have to look at these cases closely and make sure that justice was served, right? International law is very interesting, right? So the only countries that have executed more people than the United States are essentially authoritarian countries, right? So China, Iran, Iraq, countries that have not a great history of human rights, right? So in 2004, the International Court in The Hague, and that's something you should remember if you're interested in law at all or criminal justice, the International Court in The Hague, which is in the Netherlands, kind of decides how most international law is going to be interpreted, right? Everything from child custody to the death penalty. So in 2004, the International Court of The Hague ruled that international law was violated by the United States because they had Mexican nationals on death row, right? So 2004 they made that decision. In 2005, President George W. Bush agreed to abide by that decision, right, and would agree to review those cases. But most of those people were in Texas, and in 2006, the Texas Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to review that. We have our individual rights as states, and we do not agree with what President Bush said, and we're not interested in what the International Court of The Hague says, and so we are not going to review our cases with death row inmates from Mexico or any other country. In 2014, 139 foreign nationals were on death row from 36 separate countries, right? So 36 separate countries. Some more interesting statistical data, right? You are more likely, 51% of all the people on death row are in the South, 36% in the West. A mere 7% and 6% in the Midwest and Northeast, respectively, have the amount of people who are on death row are sentenced to death, right? 42% of all the people on death row are African Americans, and as you know, African American men, and as you know, they represent only 13% of the entire population of the United States, right? An interesting statistic from the state of Georgia is, in the state of Georgia, you are 10 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is any other race, right? There is also a disparity in who gets the death penalty, but it is not as striking as 10 times more likely if the victim is white. That's a whole nother social justice category for another class, another day, right? In 2000, Illinois Governor George Ryan stopped all executions in his state, right? So he's a Republican conservative governor in the state of Illinois, and he had a crisis of conscience where he said, we are not doing this right, the whole system is wrong, and we have to stop. And the reason he did that was because since 1976, so in those 24 years, 12 people had been executed in Illinois, but 13 people had been exonerated from death row. So more people had been exonerated on death row than had been executed in the state of Illinois. That's a striking statistic, right? And so he said, we're not doing this right, the whole system is faulty. He put a moratorium on all executions, and 4 years later, or several years later, no, I'm sorry, 2011, so 11 years later, the next governor, or actually it was 2 governors later, that governor had basically outlawed the death penalty, right? Now, the interesting thing about Governor George Ryan is he had campaigned on the death penalty. He campaigned on being ultra-conservative, and this essentially cost him a re-election bid, cost him a re-election campaign, this decision. And this is one of those decisions where you see a political leader an elected official, making a decision that was basically the right decision, despite the fact that it was going to hurt them, their chances to continue their career, right? So good for George Ryan. That's a summary of the death penalty for this week. You have an assignment, and essentially the assignment is to review the prison policy initiatives report on the death penalty, and write me a summary about what you're reading, right? If you're going to give me your opinion, that's fine, but I only want it in the last paragraph. I'm not interested in a full 500 words of why you don't like the death penalty or why you do like the death penalty. I want you to use that website as research to understand the death penalty, and at the end, if you feel that it's important to you, you can feel free to give me your opinion in the last paragraph or summary. All right, thanks. I'll see you next week.